This is all grounded in refusals of the nature-culture boundary. So the culture-nature boundary is the pervasive view in Western science and the global north that humans exist outside of nature. As if all the plants, animals, waters, rocks, skies, and dust of the stars comprise nature, while humans and our cultural products, including language, are something else entirely. Megan Bang traces its origin to the epistemological shifts of the 16th century when human exceptionalism became a dominant worldview in Europe, and shortly thereafter, a fundamental colonial logic. Humans, and in fact, specific kinds of humans. In the good old days, heterosexual European Christian men, and now many more, particularly white people, can fit into that category, perceive themselves as having an epistemic authority, constructing women-centered and non-Western forms of knowledge as epistemically inferior or entirely illegible, and therefore ripe for domination and assimilation. This thinking has been a cornerstone for arguments justifying invasion, extraction, settlement, and enslavement, as it allows for hierarchical thinking that can set some exceptional beings above and apart from others and their different ways of being. For many who have learned to see and be through frames of belonging to settler colonial societies, and especially for those of us who benefit from the social wages that accompanies white settler status, our settled expectations prime us to assume this boundary between human culture and nature to be real and non-controversial. Settler expectations show up in nation-state borders, schooling-based educational paradigms, scientific disciplines, climate discussions, and in the ways we, as individuals and collective entities, relate to the natural world. This is significant because settled expectations can restrict possible forms of agency, identity, and relations, indeed the only ways we may survive on this burning planet. The culture-nature boundary delimits what is possible in terms of enacting a relationship with other humans, as well as our more than human world. It is a core value of the settled imaginary that frames the knowledge building and world making that is done in and for the academy and by all of us. Some of our most fundamental disciplinary tools have proven to be inadequate for conceptualizing what is possible with language, even the very nature of what language is. We have many Indigenous colleagues who have been saying this for a very long time, and this relational orientation insists that there is a wider range of practices that can constitute languaging, and thus a wider range of possible interlocutors, which includes the living, non-human, or more than human world. There's some really excellent work that Mel has done with Mary Hermes around land as interlocutor and interlocution with more than human beings. For many Indigenous peoples, language is not a static object to simply be possessed and transmitted. Rather, it is alive, ensouled, part of the relational web that holds all humans and more than humans, and in this way is also a relative who plays a key role in our cultural continuation. Mary Hermes offers academia an example of the incommensurability of this imposed boundary with the human and more than human, or cultural and natural world, or in this case, worlds. Hermes and her colleagues note how the Anishinaabe orientation to language is reflected in the Anishinaabean word inwewin. This word tends to be translated in English, roughly, as language or talking, but the Anishinaabe word comes from the verb inwe, which is much closer to representing a characteristic call of any creature. And this includes the wind as it moves through the birches at different times of the year and seasons, and how the birds may sing to the sun at different times of day. The root meaning of inwewin reflects an epistemology in which humans are not exceptional. Humans are not the only beings who are capable of producing a characteristic call. This meaning also emerges from a knowledge system that is grounded in relationality, a way of thinking in which humans and more than humans are connected as relatives in interlocking web of relationship as one of many, not one apart, and that comes from Mary Hermes' work. This relational epistemology is non-hierarchical. It acknowledges the livingness of non-humans and more than human beings, the ensouledness of language as just one of many more than human beings itself, and is completely contrary to a knowledge system based on human exceptionalism that undergirds most of applied linguistics, and therefore second language acquisition, educational linguistics, and the work of language pedagogy. So in this project, we are asking a very large question, which is how are human-land relations expressed by academics who are operating and understanding language through this colonial academic paradigm. In other words, how are we creating and reconstituting this very, very damaging and hostile and violent way of being in the world, and with our languages themselves. We, for this part of the project, we interviewed 6 human women. So the interviewees were all women identifying, and you'll see we talk about this as human-human interviews because we are also in human, more than human conversation. And what we're trying to figure out is how do we show the ways that we talk human, more than human, and what does a human, more than human interview, like what does that transcript look like? We're working on it. We'd love to talk to any of you about it too. The interviewees were all women identifying academics who were interested in pursuing decolonial, anti-colonial, and social justice-oriented research agendas. These are all European academics. Whiteness does apply in this situation, and whiteness is something that they all identified with, although as we know, whiteness and race are categories that shift and change and don't always apply in every single context. But all 6 interviewees identified as settler, white, academic women. And they all also were pursuing decolonial, anti-colonial, and social justice research agendas within applied linguistics across multiple disciplines. When we analyzed the conversations with these interviewees, it became apparent that even among a self-selecting group of white identifying knowledge producers in the global north, there are a variety of ways in which relationships with the natural world and more than human beings are perceived and constructed, although there was a lot of discomfort and refusal from several of our interviewees to really even respond to or consider the idea that they talk with more than human beings, even as they shared very rich examples of their talking with the more than human world. At the heart of this inquiry lie questions about language, the culture-nature boundary, and the nature of knowledge production in the field of applied linguistics. So the examples are how do academics or world makers who are embedded in the knowledge production of the academy describe their languaging with the natural world? How do dominant concepts of language and applied linguistics reify the nature-culture boundary? And what is needed to subvert this, move beyond this, and engage in reclamation for our collective sustainable futures? Everyone interviewed was multilingual, and only 2, Debbie and Helmy, did not identify as settlers because they were living on lands where they had always grown up. However, these interviews took place in Finland, and Finns are settlers on Suomi land, so they didn't identify as settlers. You'll see that Debbie also is a Swedish Finn, so there's other political involvements with language that came out here, but never the idea of settlement. We do have one person who identifies as an indigenous language speaker, and that's Ona, who grew up with Catalan, and her descriptions of the more than human world and the way that she talks with the more than human world were notably different. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but we have about 14 hours of interviews with our human interviews. And what we found was that we could kind of try to categorize relationships with the more than human world in 3 ways. And so we saw this as a fearful respect towards the more than human world or nature, desire for closeness and relationship with the more than human world, and also an absence of recognition of a relationship with the more than human world. So I won't go through all of this, but the fearful respect towards, these were beings like the sea, the ocean, and viruses. These were specifically named in relationship to describing feelings of fear or fearful respect. There's many examples that were reference of desire for relationship and desire for a kinship reconnection with the more than human world and more than human beings in the more than human world and natural world. And you can see the lake, the forest, the ground, the soil, spruce tree, a very beautiful story of communicating with spruce tree, which Debbie shared and insisted that she does not communicate and talk with spruce tree, she just communes. The final category was the absence of, and this could go on and on and on and on, but there was a noticeable absence of people in our human interviews talking about the ways that they talk with, for instance, the sky, the moon, the wind, the river, and the clouds. I, for instance, talk to the wind a lot, and I thought about how my little niece and nephews, their father died very suddenly when just a couple of years ago, and they were 8 and 6, and my youngest nephew is 8 months old. And a year later, we took them to the ocean, and they'd never been to the ocean before, but their dad always wanted to take them, and they hadn't really been themselves, obviously, and we were in the ocean, and it was the 3rd day, and we're not ocean people. We grew up in Wisconsin. And it was the 3rd day, and my niece Juniper and my nephew Corbin, we looked over at them, and they were standing against the water as the waves came at them, and yelling and screaming, and my niece Juniper said, "Bring it on, bring it on!" And they were sharing out very big things that they had held inside for 9 months. And it was after that time with the ocean that I saw my nephew Corbin laugh for the first time in months. Mm-hmm. The ways that we talk with the more than human world are not always ways that we recognize, although if we think about it, I think many of us know that we do. We also know that using our human language, for instance, English, is not understandable to the wind, and the wind doesn't need it to understand what we're saying. And we may use different language to talk to the ocean, to talk to the wind, to talk to the waves, and the soil and the moon. We have many, many examples of this kind of talking. Language that is not used by human language words, for example, so it's not even looking beyond the word level, but even though the human interviews, the interviewees consistently refused to say that they talked with the more than human world. They shared many, many sorts of conversations where they did language with the more than human world in ways that perhaps the more than human world understands. So for instance, the way that our bodies may know to language with a particular stone by resting our back against it. The way that our hands may know to language with a particular tree by holding our hands against its bark in a certain way. This embodied languaging, although in the human language we may not identify as words, could be a translanguaging of our human languaging to understand and try to communicate across this imposed languaging boundary and learning the language of the more than human beings in our worlds. So one example of this is lakes. So one of the strongest and most recurring examples of conversing with more than human beings in the natural world were these examples of embodied languaging. These were times participants shared communicating with the more than human world through their bodies, occasionally with words in their minds or mouths, but oftentimes without the use of oral human language. They were not just examples of their bodies interacting with nature. These were examples where they described messages being conveyed between themselves and more than human beings in the natural world, with their bodies sharing and receiving those messages. For example, Marianne shared, I guess the moment when I feel that I talk most with the natural world would be when I swim, and I'm entering the water, and always my fingers are touching the top of the lake, and I'm in awe. And I'm always thinking, it's the gorgeous view, and I'm there, and I feel that I've just this, it's all for myself. And I feel really small, and at the same time really grounded, like I'm here, and at the same time I'm nothing. I'm just like the dock that is passing there. And I feel that then there's this kind of harmony for a moment, or something. And sometimes I also say, like, wow, this is beautiful, or you are beautiful, speaking with the lake, or something. Like talking to the lake or the water, keeping with my finger on top of it, but sometimes I also just kind of like stopping and taking it. And I guess in some way, it is like a part of a communication. When Marianne languages with the lake as a more than human being, she talks through swimming, talking to the lake or the water, keeping her finger on top of it. Her body languages with the lake as her interlocutor, and always her fingers are touching the top of the lake. She thinks and feels with the lake. There is this kind of harmony for a moment. And sometimes her embodied languaging with the lake is accompanied by oral languaging, sometimes also saying things like, "You are beautiful." This translanguaging of embodied languaging, nature, and oral languaging, human or culture, across those boundaries, those imposed boundaries, shows Marianne and the lake's meshing of languaging across the culture-nature boundary to negotiate shared meaning in this conversation. Marianne's embodied languaging is also not one-directional. She describes an interactive conversation, including receptive embodied languaging, shown by stopping and taking it, and feeling the interactive harmony with the lake, like she is the dock that is passing there. Here too, Marianne shows a perspective of alignment with the lake as her interlocutor in this conversation, locating the dock as outside of their interaction and in movement past them as they converse in harmony. This embodied languaging with more than human beings in the natural world, particularly with lakes, forest, trees, berries, mushrooms, and ground, was shared by almost every human we talked with. Aurora, who we'll share next, even described this in terms of immersion, which brought to our minds examples of language immersion, practices for learning, reclaiming, and revitalizing languages. So this is something that Aurora shared. Aurora shared how she and her husband took the dog and walked to the forest. That's always our way of problem solving. It was kind of rainy and cold, and we walked to our lake. And then we were there, and we were talking the whole time and kind of being frustrated. And then we were like, that's it, let's go for a swim. We had solved nothing. We had no idea how to solve anything. But we jumped into the lake and we swam for maybe 20 seconds. And we came out and just laughed. It felt so good. She, introducing this, shared that they were in a very, very intense disagreement and argument that felt like a breaking point, that they could not find their connection, and they had been in it for hours. We came out and just laughed. I felt so good, and somehow the problem got so small, and we were able to see all the other things around it, that the basic things are okay, and yeah, this sucks now, but we'll figure it out, and we don't know yet how. But this trust that things would, it was so strong in that moment. Like, oh, we have this magic trick where we have a problem and we can't solve it, but we jump in this lake and we still can't solve it, but it's okay, or it's more okay. It was just so intense to feel it and also to feel it together and be able to talk about it. So in her story, Aurora shared oral languaging between humans as part of a failure to use human oral talking in order to problem solve, saying we were talking the whole time and kind of being frustrated. When they met with the lake, Aurora and her partner brought their problem to the lake through the embodied languaging of swimming. The lake became a part of their conversation, a part of their problem solving, even though Aurora and her partner didn't then translate this conversation into human oral language. Their bodies experienced interactive problem solving with the lake as third person, non-human or more than human interlocutor. This is maybe not so different than one or two humans bringing a relationship question to a third person human, looking for perspective to move them past where they've become stuck. Aurora described this embodied languaging with the lake as something that offered information in the form of thoughts, feelings, and perspective that she and her partner could take up through human-human oral languaging too, saying it was so intense to feel it and also to feel it together and be able to talk about it. We have many, many more examples, including some sort of confounding ones. But I want to stop there. Because I'd like us to take a little time to, I'm happy to answer questions and talk with you all, but I'd like you to take a minute just for yourself, and then if you feel like it, with the people around you, and you're invited to do this, but you don't have to, so if you don't want to do it, nobody's making you, we never have to do anything we don't want to do. So for this, I invite you to look down or close your eyes or just not look at me. And find a moment when you remember talking with the more than human world. Now, we shared examples of the more than human world, more than human beings. But for some of us, our languages themselves are more than human beings in our worlds. I invite you to talk with your language. I invite you to talk with the more than human beings who will listen to you and talk with you back. find that moment in memory. And as you breathe and remember, I invite you to find the feeling in your body of how you talked with each other.